Welcome to the Dr. Maura Show. Whether you're at home in the Catholic Church or just peeking through the back door, the light of truth has been switched on just for you. Come on in and join me for some straight talk designed to give you a Catholic perspective on topics as diverse as the world around us. The following interview took place on August 17th, 2020. Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Maura here with my special guest, Dr. Simona Kragh. Dr. Kragh has a PhD in political science with a concentration on the American presidency and a master's degree in journalism. She originally hails from Milan, Italy, which is why you'll hear this beautiful accent that she has. But she received her degrees in the United States. And after teaching political science for many years at a small university in Virginia, she moved with her husband and her 5 beautiful children to Vermont, where she continues to teach political science online. Finally, I should also mention that Dr. Kragh is a devout Catholic who has always approached her many areas of expertise as a servant of God and the Church, which makes her perfect for this show. So welcome, Dr. Kragh.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've invited you to the show today because your many areas of expertise are relevant to a great deal of the issues that have surfaced in the news during the last few months. Oh my goodness, the world seems to have turned upside down in a very short time. We have innumerable legal controversies related to the political responses to the COVID virus, including charges of unfair and unreasonable restrictions placed on church services. We have violent riots in Seattle and Portland and Chicago and New York and a whole bunch of other cities. And they're calling for the defunding or dismantling of the police. We have an alarming string of attacks on Catholic churches and statues, and it's happening all across the nation. And these attacks have not provoked one peep of concern or outrage in secular media outlets. And then, of course, there are other attacks that are more publicized on statues that are commemorating historical figures, including abolitionists and freed slaves in the name of retribution for slavery and racism. A worldwide Black Lives Matter organization founded by people who self-identify proudly as Marxists. We have the censorship of ideas that challenge the prevailing scientific, political, and social narratives. And it's so much so that big tech companies have been called before Congress, and reporters like Bari Weiss, who resigned her post at the New York Times recently, have sounded public alarms. So many people have lost their jobs and reputations, and indeed, many have had their very lives threatened for having said something that was politically incorrect. The term cancel culture has become part of our common vocabulary, and the mainstream Democrat Party is now openly embracing socialist, reproductive, and gender policies that would have shocked mainstream America just a few short decades ago. So what is going on? My guest, Simona, who is the political scientist and educator here, is going to help us to get some understanding of our situation. And the key to this understanding is going to be getting to know something about cultural Marxism, how it has worked its way into the American culture and why it's so relevant to what we're seeing in the news. So let's begin by defining some important terms that are being tossed around quite a bit these days. First, obviously, what exactly is Marxism?
Marxism is fundamentally an economic and social theory. It was devised and developed by Karl Marx and Engels in several writings that culminated in the famous Das Kapital in 1867. It views capitalism as an intrinsically flawed system that will inevitably be replaced by a communist system. Capitalism is characterized by the dominion of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, who own the means of production. Means of production are anything that is required to turn raw material into goods that we then use. It's all the machinery, the factories, the plants, anything that is required for that process. The production, though, could not happen without the proletariat. The proletariat, that is the working class. The working class is basically in a capitalistic system based on what Marx thought is simply selling its labor to the capitalists. But the capitalists reap the benefits of the surplus value that is acquired in the process of production. Fundamentally, then you have the capitalists, this is in Marx's view, you have the capitalists acquiring more and more money on the back of the proletariat. Marx and Engels thought that this system was inherently weakened by its very nature and would eventually collapse, inevitably collapse. And he was looking forward to that a revolution that would have brought then a complete ownership of all the means of production by the proletariat. So the proletariat would have become then the winning class in this utopia that Marx envisioned.
Okay, and I understand that Marxism is characterized by a violent clash, correct? This is part of the philosophy.
Yes, the clash has to be violent because the capitalists have been exploiting the proletariat, and fundamentally, in Marx's view, they deserve what they have coming.
Okay.
So that clash has to be violent, it has to happen, and in Marx's view was pretty imminent.
So you have the oppressors and you have the oppressed.
Yes.
The oppressed rise up and they take what the oppressors have. And then what?
And then we all end up in this utopian world where everybody is going to have everything they need based on what they actually would consume, but not necessarily based on what they can produce. Therefore, there is no responsibility ultimately of the individual who is completely assimilated in the collectivity. And the individual reaps the benefits of this fantastic new world, where the capitalists finally will be the subjugated class.
Yeah.
It's looking at a decisive victory of one class over another, and it always sees history, world developments through the eyes of the clash of classes.
And as a Christian, looking at this plan, the obvious flaw would be that, it would seem that in Marxism, there is no concept of personal sin. Bad behavior is caused by bad structures and bad environment. So you get rid of the bad structures, the bad environment, and suddenly you've got this paradise where everybody's suddenly good to each other.
Yes.
And that's not going to happen because you get rid of the environment, you still have the people, you still have original sin.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
There is no such concept in what is also fundamentally an atheistic. I hesitate to call it philosophy because many philosophers balk at the idea of Marxism being considered a philosophy for many reasons that have to do fundamentally with its, shall we call it, sloppiness in the way in which it is developed.
Okay. They said it's a bad philosophy.
It's bad philosophy. Not, of course, those who approve of it, but the many that don't do not perhaps hold it in high esteem to the point of calling it a philosophy. But whatever we want to call Marxism, it is a clash of classes with a utopian ending that does not explain how we go, as you were just pointing out, from a sinful, depraved, violent set of individuals to a group of individuals that all of a sudden becomes good and good,
and suddenly we can share, and we don't need anybody
shares,
to, nobody's greedy anymore, nobody collects anymore. Right. And somehow, historically, Marxism has devolved into a totalitarian situation.
It's to be expected because, of course, it sounds good to say that we will all have what we need, no matter what we put in. But in reality, it means that somebody will be asked to give up what they have legitimately produced for someone else. And at first they might concede, a little longer they might concede, and then eventually they will reach a point where they no longer want to, because we have it, as it were, built in our hearts, that it is part of our dignity that we produce. We take pride in what we produce, and to a certain extent, it belongs to us. I mean, there is a commandment against not stealing.
Yes, exactly.
For a reason, because stealing goes to the encroachment of the individual and the individual dignity. So while Christianity obviously has the tension toward and the command to take care of our neighbor, to care for our neighbor as if we're ourselves, it doesn't mean that the deprivation of goods for our neighbor should be forced.
Right.
The point
that is called stealing, as you said.
Stealing.
You can't force people to share. That's stealing, right?
Yeah.
And of course, in Marxism, what happens is because the emphasis is on the collective, right? You have to have a representative of the collective. And the representative would be some sort of governing body or individual, and they seize the property in the name of the collective, but then they have all the power.
Yes.
So inevitably, it becomes a totalitarian regime because they're not going to want to give up that power.
Exactly. Like Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power will corrupt absolutely. And that's what happened, and we have witnessed the many communistic regimes that have emerged through the decades. They have not ended well.
Yes.
If we remember what has happened at the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have witnessed the opening of that once very closed society to the outside world, and the understanding by the Western world of what was happening, what had been happening all along in the Soviet Union, which was a forcible taking away of property, and ultimately a desperation, truly a desperation of the population that sees no point in doing better, in striving for more, because anything they do is going to be confiscated by the government and redistributed.
Yeah, and of course we can all relate to that from our own experience. Anytime you're spending somebody else's money, you're less careful with it.
Yeah.
And when you know that you're not going to reap the rewards of what you're doing, you don't bother to produce.
No,
yeah,
exactly.
Right, exactly.
And it becomes also depressive that, of course, people then resort to ways to medicate themselves against the ills that society brings along, which then results in high levels of alcoholism, for example, high levels of suicide. The entire economy and the entire society collapses.
And not to mention the fact that historically in Marxist societies, because all of the power is given to one either group of people or a single individual, any threat to that power has been put down violently, right?
And
it's done in the name of progress and equality and goodness. We know we're being violent now, but we're justified in doing so. So the philosopher Rousseau said you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet.
Yep.
So historically, Marxist regimes have been characterized by a bloodbath, and not just a little, but a whole lot of blood. And there have been literally tens of millions, perhaps even 100 million people who were murdered in communist Marxist regimes, and not just in the Soviet Union, but in China and Cambodia and several different countries in Africa.
South America.
Yeah. And it's the same everywhere you go. There is this bloodbath because of the consolidation of power, and there can be no resistance, especially resistance from religious people, because you worship the state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to replace God with something. If you take God out of the picture, then ultimately, St. Augustine says that our heart is made for God. I mean, that there's a hollow space in our hearts that can only be filled by God. Well, if God is not available, as it were, if the access to God is impeded, then human beings will eventually and inevitably try to fill that hole. and they will fill it with anything, worshiping something, a cause that they think can fix and medicate all of that emptiness that they feel. And in the process, in order to rationalize the entire enterprise, they will make other people feel as though they are the bad guy. Oh, you don't want to conform to the state. You are in the wrong. See, it's because you don't care about other people that you are resisting. Because you don't care, we have to punish you. Because it's the right thing to do. It's a creation ex novo of goodness, but on completely flawed grounds.
Yeah, so you're asked to sacrifice your life for the state,
Yes.
basically.
Ultimately, that's what happens.
Yeah. So just to recap, the defining characteristics of Marxism would be the notion that there are two kinds of people in the world. There are the oppressors and the oppressed. So the oppressors are the bourgeoisie, the oppressed are the proletariat. And justice and progress require that the proletariat rise up in violent conflict and overthrow the bourgeoisie.
Yes.
And the idea is this total revolution, this total warfare, right? Where you just tear down every system that exists because it's all oppressive. And out of this ash heap of destruction is supposed to emerge this new utopia where people are just suddenly kind to each other because all the oppressive systems have been removed. Right?
Although there is no point of reference for this utopia other than the class that brings supposedly the utopia about. There is no other...
there's no plan.
There is no plan.
Even
It
in
just
Marx,
emerges.
right?
Yes,
Even
exactly.
in Marx.
Yeah, it's simply supposed to happen. That's how
Yeah.
history is going to evolve. Now, not all Marxists think that the movement from a capitalistic to a communistic society is going to happen inevitably, but ultimately that's the goal. Whether it happens inevitably or it has to be helped along, ultimately that is the goal.
Okay, we're going to have to take a short break right now. You are listening to the Dr. Maura Show with political scientist Dr. Simona Kragh on WCLP Lake Placid. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
This episode of the Dr. Maura Show is partially funded by a grant from the Respect Life Office of the Diocese of Ogdensburg. The Respect Life Office promotes and advocates for the culture of life from conception to natural death, and is in charge of implementing the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' Pastoral Plan for pro-life activities, which include public information and education, pastoral care, public policy programs, and prayer and worship. We thank the Respect Life Office for all the good works that they do.
I'm Dr. Christopher Carr from Misericordia University with a Catholic fact. Natural family planning, or NFP, does a lot more for couples than just helping them manage their fertility. Scientifically, modern methods of NFP have advanced well beyond the traditional rhythm method developed in the 1930s. NFP methods rely on the many bodily signs that occur daily throughout a woman's cycle. And when practiced correctly, NFP is as effective for spacing pregnancies as any contraceptive, even if a woman has an irregular cycle. Furthermore, NFP is free, has no side effects, monitors reproductive health, generates open communication, and leads to greater intimacy. So while the average divorce rate is around 50%, couples who practice NFP have a divorce rate of less than 5%. Natural family planning is good for couples because it is good for their marriages. I'm Dr. Christopher Carr for Light of Truth Ministries and WCLP Radio.
We're back with political scientist Dr. Simona Kragh discussing cultural Marxism in the United States. Okay, now we started the show by talking about something about cultural Marxism. So what exactly are we talking about when we use the term cultural Marxism?
Well, it's one of those variants to which I was alluding. The idea that a communist society would have simply emerged obviously didn't pan out at first. I mean, we're talking about 1867 when Marx wrote Das Kapital, and the world just was not moving in that direction. You might have wished so, but it wasn't happening. By the early part of the 1900s, many were observing that things were moving a little too slowly. Of course, we were precipitously moving toward the October Revolution in Russia and the dethroning of the Tsar and the institution then of the Soviet Union as we then knew it for 50 years. But before then, thinkers were trying to figure out how to make this communism happen. One of those thinkers was Antonio Gramsci, who didn't live very long, died in his 40s, lived from 1891 to 1937. And noting that the revolution was just not happening in Italy, which was his country of origin, he started thinking that maybe we should try a different approach. We should help the revolution along by infiltrating the culture. And the culture is to be infiltrated in any way possible. The ports of entry are multiple. The media, at the time, therefore, just newspapers, the schools, the unions. The proletariat would have to be set ablaze, fundamentally, with revolutionary ideas in a more subtle fashion that would permeate their thinking in everything they did. And the sooner that infiltration would start in the individual's life, the better. So schools had to be part of that infiltration. Entertainment had to be part of that infiltration. So that fundamentally people would get used to the idea, would see a normalization of communistic ideas until the full reveal of the revolution would come to pass and nobody would resist it. It's,
yeah, so you have a Western society that's very comfortable.
Yes.
So it's kind of hard to get people to want a revolution because they're kind of comfortable, right?
Right.
And it's not going to come about in a military way. So we're going to capture the imaginations. We're going to capture the minds of people and turn them into true believers.
And of course, what stopped Gramsci from continuing his work amongst the public directly was the advent of fascism in 1922. And Gramsci was imprisoned, and then the conditions in the prisons were such that on an already failing health caused his premature passing. But even from prison, he wrote some famous works, they variably translated, but fundamentally those are diaries they wrote while in prison, talked specifically about the infiltration of everything, media, schools, politics, labor unions.
And when he's talking about the infiltration, is he talking about infiltration in Italy or is he talking about here?
His first concern and his first mandate, he was taking orders from Moscow. From the revolutionaries that were already setting the stage in Russia, then Soviet Union. So his main mandate was Italy. That's where he was supposed to strengthen the Communist Party, make it popular, normalize it, etc. But ultimately, communism is supposed to be all over the world. So he knew he was going to be a cog in a much larger machine, which was the global revolution that would come to pass.
Okay, we should probably explain that because I remember when we talked prior to the broadcast here, we were talking about how Marxism is by its very nature a universalist sort of movement. Why is that?
It has to be because otherwise there would be no acceptable victory of the proletariat. For as long as there are capitalists that can potentially hold the means of production, it means that one class or one part of the class will be subjugated to the other. Capitalism has to disappear completely. Systemic oppression is what communists look at in capitalism, what they see in capitalism. The system itself is evil. It has to be completely eliminated from the root. It is not sufficient to take out individuals because the individuals are just part of a larger system that is intrinsically wrong.
Okay, so Gramsci is working on the educational system
Yeah.
in Italy. And what year is this again?
The years around the late 1920s, early 1930s. He started even before then writing, but that's when he became most prominent. And then he passed away in 1937.
Okay, so now I've got two more questions that just came into my mind. So first of all, was Gramsci fairly successful with his endeavor in Italy?
He was, to the extent that Italians accepted communism, and it never quite clicked the way in which it clicked in Russia. In the Communist Party in Italy for a long time was incredibly strong, at least until they followed the Soviet Union. Then it split into an original communism and a variant of communism to reinvent itself, as it were, and survive the demise of the Soviet Union that had obviously publicized, made available for everyone the negative side of communism. But that success can in large part be attributed to Gramsci and to a number of other thinkers that surrounded him and followed in his footsteps. To that extent, he was successful. He was successful in curbing the efforts of a more conservative wing of Italian politics. But for all its strength, it did not manage to produce the revolution that Gramsci would have preferred. Just a last note, in the late 1960s, the early 1970s, there were elements of communism in Italy, though, that were particularly violent and took direct funding, for as much as we know, from the Soviet Union through communist hands, the money that then would go to terrorist groups such as the Red Brigades.
Fascinating. But since we're talking to an American audience, so our concern would be what's going on over here. How does this idea of cultural Marxism come to the United States?
The strongest roots of that movement were from the Frankfurt School. And so a number of German thinkers who escaped Germany at the advent of Hitler. Many escaped because of their religious roots. Many were Jewish. And some of them worked even for the American government. A guy by the name of Marcuse worked for the government in the Office of Strategic Service, the precursor to the CIA.
Wow.
But then during that period actually was critical of the Soviet Union. So we see somewhat of a departure from the Marxist Leninism that was lived in the USSR. Nevertheless, it was still a Marxist, still believed in the communist ideals, and saw the seeds in the United States, especially by working in American institutions such as Columbia. Then we have people like Erich Fromm, same school. He was more of a psychoanalyst, worked also in the United States in prestigious colleges, prestigious universities, infiltrated American culture through academia, fundamentally. And what they both had in common was progressivism. Progressivism as that subset of communism that focuses on constant social change. Constant for as long as it takes, I should say, to reach the communist ideal. But that means that everything that is already in place in society, in culture, in entertainment, in politics, in education, has to be dismantled. Among the elements that need to be dismantled, for example, is the family. The most basic of the anchors we have to stability had to be dismantled because it was part of that bourgeoisie thinking that, like the rest of the bourgeoisie, had to go.
And of course, a strong family is a threat to the totalitarian state.
Exactly.
Because that gives you a sense of identity. It helps you to resist.
Exactly. And actually, I should pick up from what you're saying, because resist is something that was often proposed by these thinkers. Resist the proletariat.
Wow.
It was part of their vocabulary at the time. Outside the Frankfurt School, you have people like John Dewey, who was instrumental in writing curricula for schools, for the school system. And
that's a very familiar name because most people have heard of the Dewey Decimal System, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's John Dewey.
But his thinking was, if we think of a library and the order that is required in a library, well, the opposite was true for him in society. The destruction of morality was fundamental because, again, it was a product of the bourgeoisie. It had to be done away with because it was a form in their thinking of entrapment of the proletariat. So if the proletariat wants to stand out of that logic of oppression, it has to eliminate everything that is oppressive, including morality.
All structure.
All structures, to the
And
root.
moral. So yeah, I've recently read the autobiography of Bella Dodd, who became famous during the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. She was a very high-ranking communist who became very active in the Communist Party and became one of their highest-ranking national members. And most of her work was in trying to infiltrate politics through the teachers' union and other labor unions. It's a fascinating book. And she testified, of course, at the McCarthy trials, which is why we know about her. But yeah, so she's yet another person. So we have these people from Germany, primarily the Frankfurt School of Marxism, that escape Germany when Hitler rises to power. They come to the United States. They embed themselves in academia and some political offices, and they're very educated people, so they embed themselves wherever it is possible. And this is a conscious effort on their part to transform our culture and help people to see the glories of the communist ideal, the Marxist ideal, right? And they work through education. And so this is how they're creating a culture of Marxism without people even realizing it. They're just getting people used to this idea, and they start in education when people are very young and very open and susceptible. How is cultural Marxism apparent in our popular culture today? Have they been successful in your estimation?
Incredibly successful. One of the things that we witness in every form of entertainment is the lack, in fact, of morality, going back to what we were just saying. So extreme promiscuity that is now accepted as a fact. A very large percentage of young people choose not to marry before they live together. They just live together and have children while living together. And if they get tired, they just move apart. And that's the end of it. And that has been normalized by the entertainment culture. Anything that has to do with pride in the American system is now ridiculed. The burning of the flag that used to be the hallmark of what Iranians would do in the 1970s.
I remember that.
Enraging everyone is now something that is considered perfectly normal and to be applauded. Kneeling for the flag, for the national anthem, rather, in a sign of disrespect for an oppressive system. If you notice, the vocabulary is exactly that of communists that didn't identify specific individuals that were doing wrong things. And there were many in capitalism, like in any other system. They accused the system of being evil. So America is evil. The system is evil. So we have to do away with it. We have to resist the, as I was saying before, the hymn of certain elements of the left. It's not sufficient to disagree with political views.
You have to eradicate them.
You have to eradicate them, and it's a raised fist kind of stance. It's that violent stance of the communist. There has been a loss of any sense of beauty, even in education, or any sense of propriety. It's a detail, but I think a telling one. The educational system has now, I think, decided, after waxing and waning for a while, to do away with cursive. Well, is that important? Probably not radically important to the survival of American civilization. But what does that communicate? It tells us that culture is no longer important as a window into the good, the true, and the beautiful. It is simply a means to an end. And in that logic, the student just becomes a cog in the machine that will, almost like one of those animals that is used for experiments, be exposed to certain stimuli to which he or she will have to respond, and then there will be an adaptation to the stimulus, and then the process will start all over again. The sense of the beauty of art or the beauty of music is being lost. And if you will, the beauty of one's handwriting,
Sure.
which, as I said, it's a detail, but telling, because as you were referencing earlier, unions have been infiltrated. Education unions, the unions of educators have been heavily infiltrated, and educators, teachers belong in very large numbers to teachers' unions, the NEA, the AFT, and those unions, by published records available to everyone, donate between 95 and 97% of their money to the Democratic Party only. There is absolutely no diversity in the education system, K through 12, and then especially in colleges and universities. A recent pamphlet released by the NEA, I believe, or associated with it, explains why socialists should become teachers. That's the title. In the title, they are going right out and coming right out and saying that a socialist should become a teacher.
Yeah, it was written by the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission and the Young Democratic Socialists of America, although the NEA, the National Education Association, aligns itself with the work.
Why is that important that a socialist should become a teacher? Interestingly enough, throughout the pamphlet, the authors dance around it. But there's a somewhat telling passage at one point that describes how the process of teaching cannot be automated, like many others. Teachers will always, therefore, be necessary, and especially teachers for children with special needs. So as long as the narrative is maintained that teaching can be done only by teachers, and especially children with special needs can be taught only by the experts, then teachers...
As opposed to parents.
As opposed to parents.
Yeah.
Then teachers will always be necessary, and they will always be in contact with the rest of society. I'm saying that they dance around the issue because from what I could tell, they are not explicit in saying, and that's how we indoctrinate the younger generation.
Interesting.
But it's a conclusion that can be easily drawn from even just the title.
Now, I want to stop you just for a minute because we've introduced a new term, socialism. Very few people in the public eye, almost nobody, identifies themselves as a Marxist these days. The grand exception is probably the two of the founders of the BlackLivesMatter.org, the international organization, Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garcia. Cullors has stated on more than one occasion that the two of them are, and I'm quoting, trained Marxists. Cullors says specifically that she was trained in community organizing by Eric Mann, who was of the Weather Underground, and we will get to that connection in a moment. But most political figures do not call themselves Marxists because the name has very bad connotations, right? So most people in politics today call themselves socialists or they call themselves progressives. So I think we should examine those terms. So what is socialism first?
Fundamentally, it's a variant of communism. is, if you will, it's communism light, in the sense that Marxism would propose an ownership of all the means of production and all resources by the proletariat, whereas with socialism, what you have is an ownership of certain types of resources, such as the holding in common of all the resources that are required to provide healthcare, or all the resources required to provide education for all, the resources required to offer individuals who find themselves unemployed assistance. All of those are actually socialist programs, but they were introduced in the United States in the 1930s, when people were
FDR,
desperate. FDR introduced them with the New Deal at the moment when the population felt desperate and needy. And here comes FDR and says, I can help you, I can rescue you. You all are unemployed. There's an employment rate between 25 and 35%. The government will take care of you. It was not the first time that the United States was going through a major economic crisis, but up to then, in part because of the lack of technology to reach everyone fast, people have fundamentally fended for themselves. And what I mean by that is that they would go to the group that was closest to them. The neighbors would help. The church would help. That's where people would find their support until they were done living through a rough patch. 1929, the crash, the drama associated with all of that, and the introduction of a leader like FDR, particularly charismatic, the ability that FDR had to associate himself with the population through radio, for example, made him palatable figure, an approachable figure. And when he said, I'm going to take care of you, that became accepted.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment, because I think there's probably a lot of people out there thinking, well, I kind of like having a free school. I kind of like Social Security. I mean, that's a big battle almost every election. That, they're going to take away my Social Security. Don't do that. What's wrong with that?
In principle, I guess one would say if that's where it ends, that's where it stops, there might be nothing wrong with it. But then there are always strings attached. And the strings attached are, for example, we could have healthcare for all, but we have to accept to go to the physician that
then you give control
that is controlled,
to whenever you give the authority, and whenever you look to the government to protect you and take care of you, then they have all the control.
Yes.
So so is that really a good idea?
Exactly. And now we are in a system where basically we have already paid into our Social Security, so we don't want it to be taken away because that's our money. So we have entered a perverse system where it's going to be difficult to get out of it, because we are used to it, we expect it, and now if somebody is unemployed, the person goes to the unemployment office, not to the neighbor, and the neighbor who is asked for any assistance would say, why are you asking me? Go to the government.
Now, can a society have socialist elements in it without being a socialist society?
Theoretically, yes. The reason why I was prefacing my comments by saying that if that's where it ends, maybe that's not such a bad idea, in the sense that typically it's a slippery slope, and it just doesn't stop. And the proof of it is right in front of our eyes. Everything was supposed to be limited to Social Security and women who found themselves widowed, so that they could have help for themselves and their children at the time when not a lot of women had well-paying jobs. Okay, that's 1930s. But now we are in 2020, and there are presidential candidates who are talking about having a single-payer insurance. And
once again, I think it's important to distinguish from a Christian perspective. There's certainly nothing wrong with collective security so long as it's voluntary.
Yes.
That's the key. You can't force people to share without stealing from them. That's the fundamental problem from a Christian perspective.
And that's why some initiatives have now emerged with people forming safety nets, as it were, from an healthcare standpoint, where they put together their resources and work in a almost insurance system, but in the sense that they all contribute to a common pot from where people who are then subscribers to the system can draw in order to pay for their healthcare needs. Under the understanding that some people might never use the money they put in. But they voluntarily put in the money because it is good to take care of your neighbor. That neighbor might be you at some point. So all of us might, at one point or another in our lives, need a certain type of health assistance that can only be accessed with a very large amount of money that would send most people bankrupt. That's why people come together, but it's voluntary. Interestingly, a lot of these groups come together with some conditions. For example, if health is the reason why you come together, then you should not impose on others the high costs of bad choices. And members of these groups often have to promise to not engage in drugs, excessive alcohol, or any other practice that would increase healthcare risks that then would be carried by everyone else. So it's a common pot, but a common pot with a certain level of responsibility, and not a situation where, as you were saying earlier, you're not as careful with somebody else's money. So you live as you please, and then you have somebody else carry the weight.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that at least, up until now, we are a democratic republic with socialist elements in it? We're not a socialist country, although now we have politicians who are calling themselves socialists and would like to create a socialist country. So to make this transition from where we are now to a truly socialist country would require what the majority of the means of production would have to be owned by the government, basically.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and I might remind the listening audience that USSR, the name of the former Soviet Union, stands for the United Socialist Soviet Republic, right?
Yeah.
So, and the word Nazi also was the German word for the National Socialist. So both of these systems were socialist systems where the government owned all the means of production, or most of it anyway. Okay. I just need to interject a couple of distinctions for the sake of our listening audience right here. These distinctions are really key to our discussion. There is a difference between a welfare state and a socialist state, right? I mean, the welfare state is one in which the government provides tax-funded safety nets, like Social Security, as we've been talking about. But a socialist system is one in which the government actually owns and runs businesses. So the government is actually your employer, for example, for our public school system, which means that the government has the final say over the curriculum, and it negotiates wages with the unions and all sorts of things. And, another socialist system that we have right now in this country that I can think of is our veterans hospital system. In the veterans hospital system, the government determines what care is provided. It determines the way it's distributed and all sorts of things. The church has no unilateral objections to generous welfare systems. Of course, it cautions against giving up personal freedoms, as we've been talking about, in exchange for safety. And also, there have been several Catholic thinkers that have noted that welfare systems tend to degrade Christian impulses. So, for example, the late Justice Antonin Scalia once said, and I'm going to read this, "The transformation of charity into legal entitlement has produced donors without love and recipients without gratitude." I think that's something to think about. Now, the church allows for a society to incorporate some socialist elements, like public schools, as we've been talking about. Again, though, there is this caution about giving up control over your child's education to the government. Also, while it might be okay for the government to offer a free service, or a tax-funded service, I should say, it is certainly not okay to eliminate other options. And this is exactly what happens in socialist countries. Here in the United States, you can send your child to a public school, or at least in theory, you can opt out of that, and you can send your child to a private school or even homeschool your child. But in thoroughly socialist countries like the former Soviet Union or China, you have to send your child to the government-run school. And, in European countries that have adopted a great deal or a great degree of socialism, your choices are also limited. So, for example, it is actually illegal to homeschool your child in Germany. And in Sweden, I understand homeschooling is only permitted in extraordinary cases. So I think it's telling that in this country, the people who favor socialism tend to be against school choice. And I think that it's because there's this notion that the state is a far better educator than parents are. And therefore, the state should take control of education away from parents. Now, the church has always firmly and consistently affirmed the special authority of parents to raise their own children, and it certainly objects to state interference in that authority. Okay, so that is what I wanted to interject there, and now I think we need to move on to something else. Let's move on to the idea of progressivism. What is progressivism?
Progressivism is fundamentally the living out of communism in society. It's the social attention that the communists would give. In a progressive system, any structure that is pre-existing has to be eliminated. The individual has to think outside the box, break with these chains that were created by the commonsensical bourgeoisie mentality, and live a completely rethought life within the collective. The individual should be submitted to the collective, and typically, a progressivist view includes an attention to the environment because it's part of the collective, because it's where the collective lives. And interestingly, it has a lot of eugenic elements.
Oh, okay. And explain that for our listening audience. What does that mean?
Eugenic comes from two Greek words, eo, which means good or well, and gen, which means to generate. In a sense, we could translate it as generating well, but it's fundamentally the view that proposes that only the most fit should live. The others don't deserve to.
And what is the connection there?
Well, of course, eugenics was a large part of Nazism. Margaret Sanger, who subscribed to eugenics and then befriended several elements in the Nazi Party.
And Margaret Sanger was, of course, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Yeah.
Yes. And we know from her original writings and correspondence with people like Dubois that the idea was to get rid of anybody who is unfit, including several elements of the African American community.
Is the philosophical connection simply that if the human race is to progress, it must become biologically superior? Okay, so that's the philosophical connection there. Interesting.
Yes, the idea of the master race was included in Sanger's writings, and it is part of progressivism. Progressives are the first to say that in order to protect the environment, we need to reduce the world population. Because that is a weight on the environment that is important to the collective. The individuals should be submitted to the collective, as we were saying. Therefore, in order to protect the resources of the collective, the environment has to be protected. Therefore, only those who are fit should be part of society, and those who do not have a high likelihood of producing very fit people should not procreate. And if anybody is born that is not fit for society, should be eliminated.
Wow. So is it accurate to say that either Marxism or cultural Marxism is a kind of an umbrella term that would include socialism and progressivism as variants of the general idea, the same general idea.
It is. And all those elements can be found by anyone who would like to run an internet search on websites such as that of the NEA, the Teachers Union, the support for what are called reproductive rights. Is abortion, and ultimately it's linked to eugenics. The prevention from any choice, vouchers, school vouchers, charter schools, homeschooling, all of that is condemned in the webpage of the Teachers Union because it does not fit the narrative that everybody should conform to the socialist and ultimately communist ideas that we have been talking about. So communism is the root, and then to make it more palatable, it has been called socialism, it has been called progressivism, but fundamentally it's
But they all end up in the same place.
It's the same place.
Now, I can just hear some of my friends who have sympathies with socialism just saying, well, wait a minute now, not every socialist society in the history of the world has been violent. Look at Scandinavia. Look at Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark, I think, and even parts of Western Europe, right? Is this a fair comparison? Are these truly socialist countries? And if they are, then how did they escape this bloodbath?
The reality of it is that they are not a lot more socialist than we are at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, they can still maintain that delicate balance between the people's submission to the system because it's good. It's good for you. It's good for the grandma. It's good for your children.
That is what the proponents are saying.
Yes, okay, exactly. Okay. And the need for violence. Asking more of a population than what the population can tolerate ends up in violence. Where is that point? Where is that trigger where people are going to rebel and not even care if they die, as long as they can get rid of an oppressive system? That point changes and is variable from population to population because of historical circumstances, cultural circumstances, religious, many variables come into play. But every population has a breaking point where they will take a lot, and once they feel they will have nothing to lose by rebelling against an oppressive government, then they will. An example is China. China has been communist to the point of making millions disappear. I mean, we really do not even know the number of the people who have died under the communist regime. Did they rebel? Well, not at first. Maybe they tried. Maybe there were peasants' revolts and they were taken down. But most of us have seen, either because we were alive at the time or because we can find the images on YouTube, we have seen the revolts of young people in Tiananmen Square. And how they were taken down. So even a population that is accustomed to an authoritarian regime gets to a point where it's too much, and then they rise. And it never ends well. So Scandinavian countries, as you were referencing, are in a very delicate balance where so far the people are pretty happy. They have what they want. They have what they need. They are also much smaller societies, quite homogeneous, with not a lot of forces pulling them apart. So they kind of go along. How much more can a Scandinavian government ask of them? And the taxation rate in Scandinavian countries is very high. But they are also very comfortable. If that taxation level were to go to a point where it's excessive compared to what the people are getting, they're not going to like it. At that point, the government that was completely peaceful until yesterday will turn on them on a dime, will repress them, and that's where they will revolt.
Actually, yes, and I've understood from other people who are economists, I am certainly not, that the Western European countries that have an overwhelming amount of socialism in their systems still retain enough capitalism so that they have a productive society. And even in the Scandinavian countries, I understand, while the taxes that people pay on their incomes, and they have this VAT tax, the value added tax, are very high, that the people who own corporations hardly pay any taxes at all. And so in a way, I've also heard that it is actually easier to start a business in some of these countries than it is here because they have fewer regulations. So it's not really comparable to what's going on here. And then also I understand that the taxes are distributed very equally among people so that there isn't this huge class division in terms of what people pay. Whereas over here we have, the rich should pay everything and, the poor should pay nothing. And in these Scandinavian countries especially, it's actually fairly equally distributed. Everybody is paying a pretty good amount.
Which is possible because, as I said, a society is rather homogeneous. It doesn't mean that everybody is exactly the same.
So they have a kind of we might say a tribal cohesion.
Yes.
Kind of, I identify with you. It's true if you identify with your neighbor, then you are much more likely to want to take care of your neighbor. Right? You feel the group identity.
In fact, I think it was Sweden that in recent years saw the emergence of an outright racist anti-immigrant party, just as part of the platform. We don't want immigrants.
Yeah.
It is not as plausible to see that that would be something that could emerge in the United States, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, the label just wouldn't fly.
Right. Absolutely. We are nothing if not a nation of immigrants, right? Okay, well, we're going to have to take a short break. You are listening to the Dr. Maura Show with political scientist Dr. Simona Kragh on WCLP Lake Placid. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
WCLP and Light of Truth Ministries are underwritten by the Knights of Columbus Council 599, a fraternal order of Catholic men who believe in the honor and integrity of standing up for God, church, and country. Catholicism is under attack by the secular culture of death. And if you want to engage in the battle to protect our Catholic identity and our way of life, become a Knight of Columbus. Charity, unity, fraternity, and patriotism have been the Knights' guiding principles for more than 130 years. For more information about the Knights of Columbus, contact Deacon John Fehlner at 518-312-5636. That's 518-312-5636. May God bless and keep you.
Are you haunted by the pain of guilt, regret, and remorse? The burden of poorly made choices? Perhaps it's time to ask the Lord for His healing grace and infinite mercy found in the sacrament of reconciliation. Sin separates us from God and diminishes our ability to love and to live life to the fullest. When we bring our sins into the confessional, we open the door to the abundance of God's grace, and He begins to repair the damage that we've done. Sin, like any bad habit, must be conquered with time and persistence. Meet the Lord in the confessional whenever you fall, and you will be transformed.
We're back with political scientist Dr. Simona Kragh discussing cultural Marxism in the United States. As a theologian, I would like to recall what the Church's magisterium has had to say about both Marxism and socialism. Now, historically, papal encyclicals have been critical of both Marxism and socialism on one hand and capitalism on another. They're critical of both systems. And when it comes to economics or politics or social constructs, the Church customarily limits its criticisms to errors in principle. So it does not, as a rule, say that you have to adopt this or that system, because the church recognizes that the fields of economics and politics, et cetera, are, they're contingent upon circumstances, and they're really beyond the church's particular scope of expertise. So they talk about morality. The church is concerned with morality, and they talk about moral principles, and they look at systems and say, okay, this part of the system works with Christian morality, this part doesn't. So if you can alter it, fine. So for example, when they're speaking of capitalism, the church documents have noted many serious problems with the notion that, for instance, the market is a mechanistic reality that lies outside the realm of morality. That is not acceptable from a Christian point of view. It has also noted problems with the promotion of the vice of greed, unbridled competition, the use of people as a means to an end, and the concept of absolute ownership that denies the human role of steward in a universe that was created and owned by God. So morally, the capitalist never has a right to ignore the common good. However, the church has always defended the right of individuals to own private property because, as the church has pointed out, owning private property is integral to maintaining human dignity. It acknowledges that the use of capital in trade is beneficial in many ways, and it has commended the capitalist production and distribution of wealth that has alleviated poverty all over the world. So there are parts of capitalism that the church says, okay, you got to fix this. And there are parts of capitalism where the church says, this is great. This is the way we should be working. So you kind of get the impression that if you could alter capitalism a little bit, refine it, fine tune it, we'd be okay. But the church's response to Marxism and socialism has been a little different. Marxism has been clearly and consistently condemned by the church because it is, by definition, atheistic, materialistic. It incites violence as a means to progress. And the church also objects to the elimination of private ownership of the means of production because, as we've mentioned, private ownership is essential to human dignity and spiritual growth. Why? Because, as the Vatican II document called Gaudium et Spes points out, spiritual growth depends upon the ability to give, and you cannot give if you do not first own, right? Mm-hmm. And very much what you own and what you produce is an extension of yourself. So you should, by injustice, have some say over what happens to that. The exercise of free will, the ability to choose what is good, is absolutely essential to our spiritual development. And socialism, in many ways, takes away our free will. And of course, when you turn your free will over to someone else, there's always the danger that you'll be asked to participate in something that's immoral. Now, there have been several encyclicals, such as Mater et Magistra and Quadragesimo Anno, that have also condemned socialism as inherently evil. And this whole conversation might seem somewhat shocking to some of our listeners because socialism is, as we've been pointing out, it's usually presented as a way to take care of your neighbors, and we know we need to do that. So socialism appeals to our sense of social justice. And Pope Benedict XVI even has pointed out that socialist movements have raised awareness of our need to be concerned about the common good, and that in some ways, socialist ideals correspond to Catholic social teaching. However, there are two big problems that the church has identified at the very core of socialism. First, like Marxism, socialism involves communal ownership of the means of production, and that is an offense against human dignity for all the reasons we've just said. In addition, the transition from private to public ownership requires some sort of seizure of private property by public authorities of some sort or communal authorities of some sort. And that's called theft, which is what we've been talking about. Now, more recent theorists have pointed out that the concept of socialism has expanded into many different systems over the years. They usually point to Western Europe, and they say that there are contemporary forms of socialism, such as democratic socialism, or Christian socialism that actually avoid the errors that are noted in the magisterial documents. So they'll say, well, the popes, they really had in mind Marxism when they were talking about this, not democratic socialism. The democratic socialists of America have gained quite a following in the last few years. As everybody knows, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, otherwise known as AOC, describes herself as a member, although she is working within the Democrat Party. I believe Bernie Sanders identifies specifically with the Democrat Socialists of America. I could be wrong. He does. Okay. So my question to you after my little diatribe there, after my little speech, what is democratic socialism and what is Christian socialism? And do they actually avoid the errors that have been condemned by the church?
The short answer is no. We wish they could because, as you're correctly pointing out, socialism appeals to our desire to take care of our neighbor and also appeals to our desire to have a safety net if something were to happen to us that is beyond our control. But ultimately, socialism remains socialism. It is simply a light version of communism. And as I was explaining before, communism has a drive to take over the entire world in a communist utopia. One step in that direction sometimes happens to be socialism, but ultimately the goal is communism. So that is one thing to be kept in mind, that it is a slippery slope, inherently slippery. It is not socialism is not separate from Marxism. It is a way to Marxism. Democratic socialists might like to put the emphasis on the fact that they are separate from the autocratic, authoritarian variant of Marxism that we have seen in the Soviet Union, that we still see in North Korea, for as little as we can see of North Korea, and that should already tell us a lot, that we see in China and so forth. They want to distinguish themselves from that and say, we just want an economic socialism. We do not want a political communism.
I've heard on the Democratic Socialists of America website, they say, we want to bring the principle of democracy into the workplace. So to give workers control, a democratic voice in the company that they work for.
Which could sound at first as a way of including the dignity of the individual into the socialist thinking and elevating it. What tends to happen, however, because of the very nature of socialism, is that ultimately everything gets taken down, including the individual. So in a company, in a factory, in an economic situation where you still have somebody who owns the company and the workers on the other side, an inclusion of the workers in the governance of the company can only go so far. Ultimately, somebody has to make a decision. And if the workers are unhappy with the ultimate decision that is being made by the owner of the company, I wouldn't say that violence immediately would ensue, but certainly a large level of unhappiness, strikes.
Yes.
Therefore, you have people who are home, people who are unhappy, production that is being halted, an entire chain of production that is being disrupted because of the strike. There's disruption in any case that is not going to be limited to a squabble around the table between the owner of the company and the proletariat and the working class, as we prefer to say today.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the basic flaw is really one of efficiency. Not every company would work well with every single person trying to run the company. You can't have that, right? So you inevitably say, well, me as the individual worker, I don't have the time or maybe the education or the skills to make all of these decisions. So, hey, why don't we elect a representative, right? And then the representative gets to make the decision, but ultimately that devolves into
Power grab.
A power grab,
Yeah.
right? Ultimately, the power is being consolidated once again. I would also remind viewers that under a capitalist system, you can have a co-op. We have co-ops, right? So if your business works well with that kind of structure, you are certainly able to do that in the system that we have now. We don't require a socialist system in order to do that if you want to. But the difference, of course, would be in a socialist system, you would have to do that.
Right. And the premise in the socialist, and again, I insist, the Marxist system, is that the owner of the company, to make it simple, the capitalist, does not have a right, does not deserve the extra money. And that is a fundamental distinction to be made with our view as Christians. Every individual has an inherent value, no matter what that individual does, thinks, or is capable of doing. One of the least accepted propositions of a free society is that not everybody has the same level of intelligence. Not everybody has the same level of entrepreneurship. And we are all endowed with certain talents, strengths, characteristics that are at variance with those of others. So I could be a very committed worker and be very precise in what I am doing in the chain of production. But I just don't have the creativity, the connections, the initiative to be an entrepreneur. Is that bad? No. It simply means that we all have different characteristics. And instead of accepting each other as made in God's image and therefore endowed with a dignity beyond this world, we reduce everything to the material and to the fact that this guy has more money than I do and he doesn't deserve it because I worked hard for it on the floor of the company, and he doesn't deserve that money and I want a piece of the pie. But that guy didn't sleep at night because all the responsibility of the company was on his shoulder.
Yeah, he took all the risks.
Yeah, he took all the risks.
And he had the vision,
yes,
which not everyone can do.
Exactly.
And he was able to organize, or she was able to organize, right?
Exactly.
Which not everyone has the skills to do.
And
so
obviously there are abuses. Obviously there are abuses that should be halted. There is no question. But that doesn't mean that inherently the system is flawed.
Right. Or that everybody should get exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the Christian version of socialism that you were asking about, unfortunately, ends up doing the same thing. So there's, again, an attempt through Christianity to elevate socialism, and instead what eventually ends up happening is that socialism takes Christianity down. Because instead of being allowed to remind everyone we all have the same dignity because we are made in God's image, no, we actually need to fight and we need to have more power because we don't have enough, because the proletariat is being kept down by the capitalist class. If everything is centered on one person doesn't deserve more than I do, it's all based on envy fundamentally, and it is inherently not Christian.
How do the Christian socialists identify themselves? What do they say is the difference between them and other forms of socialism?
One way in which socialism is made palatable to the Christian audience is in terms, again, of care. So their identification is that of compassion. If there's one word that summarizes the position of the Christian democratic, the Christian socialist, is compassion. In the complementarity of contemplation of God and work with our fellow human beings, that always has to happen together. They put a lot of emphasis on the work on the fellow human being, and then put on top of that a label of Christian. Well, you cannot remain a Christian without the contemplation part, the contemplative part, the recognition at all times that God is supposed to be at the center of our lives. Working for people, a good thing, dissociated from that foundation, our life in God, becomes simply another form of social engagement.
So the democratic socialists and the Christian socialists do not avoid the errors that are condemned by the church.
Not in my opinion.
It's fundamentally the same system with a little different window dressing, basically. Nonetheless, socialism is incredibly popular. It's incredibly popular among academics, among people who work in Hollywood, people in print and televised and online media. I've even read the occasional articles published in Catholic media extolling the virtues of socialism. I read one not too long ago in America Magazine. Bernie Sanders is an avowed socialist. He actually honeymooned in Moscow when it was the capital of the Soviet Union.
He did.
And he has famously sung the praises of Castro's Cuba and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And he has been embraced by the mainstream parties. So he denies that he's a Marxist, but he has certainly been quite vocal in his praise of Marxist systems. Hillary Clinton has described herself as a progressive, which, as we've mentioned, is kind of a subset of Marxist communism. And AOC, of course, is a self-described democratic socialist working within the Democratic Party. Now, ironically, all of this is happening at a time when both the Democrats and the Republicans are expressing concern over attempts by the Marxist Chinese government and the historically Marxist Russian government. They're not officially communist anymore, but historically they led the charge to exercise covert influence over our national political and business initiatives. They've been hacking emails, etc. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how we got here. We said that there were scholars that came over from Frankfurt. Among them were Herbert Marcuse and Erich Fromm. And they tried to advance cultural Marxism in the United States, just getting people accustomed to the idea. And it seems from the incredible popularity that their techniques were quite successful. And we talked a little bit about how they were particularly interested in influencing the American educational curricula. Is there any other evidence in the American educational curricula that shows the influence, the successful influence of these men that wanted to get the American psyche kind of accustomed to and open to this idea of Marxism, socialism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it?
I would say two things. One, the type of sex education that has been promoted in the school system, the public school system, and the other is the particular brand of social justice that is being proposed to our children. I think it has become common knowledge that sex ed is not just teaching human biology to children, but it has now collected a lot of historical anecdotes on how alternative sexual practices are being promoted. One of the more recent examples, I think it was a couple of years ago, the superintendent for public schools in Arizona, the equivalent of the Secretary of Education in most other states, when running for office, filled out a ballotpedia, which maybe some people refer to when making a decision for voting. So this would be her own words. This is nothing that has been distorted by the media. And she was very clear that she was going to embrace the LGBTQ community and of course, all of their needs. Recently, because of the consequences of the lockdown, a lot of people have had to move their children to a remote type of learning. This apparently many states is going to continue. Well, teachers are expressing concern that parents might be listening in to the lessons that are being taught to the children. And the listening in apparently is particularly feared when it comes to sex ed. And unfortunately, or fortunately, a lot of parents are having their eyes opened in these recent conditions. I homeschool my children along with my husband, of course, and I am part of several groups, national groups that exchange ideas about how to best teach children at home and so forth. And one of the concerns that is emerging over and over again is that of parents who have become homeschoolers because of COVID and are pouring their hearts out online, describing situations such as, I have a 9th grader and I have just found out he can only read at 4th grade level. And this happens over and over again, and they are desperate. They they feel like they have been betrayed by the school system, a school system that when they thought that the 3 hours were being covered just fine, no, it was teaching the children, sexual behaviors that are not part of the mainstream or are not necessarily approved by all parents, and actually encouraging it. So that's one element that has bloomed in all its force from its original starting points with the Frankfurt School and Dewey and his teachings. By the way, Dewey was so influential that, according to some sources, by the 1970s, there was no teacher that had not been instructed in his methods.
Wow.
So by now, Dewey's systems are simply accepted as
they're the norm.
They are the norm. And working in groups, for example, in the classroom is part of what Dewey promoted. Having students participate in the governance of the school is part of what Dewey promoted. And of course, as more experienced adults, we know that authority is there not as a form of power grab, but as a form of protection. Authority is there to make sure, in the case of the educational system, that the children actually learn what they're supposed to learn. If they are involved in the governance of the school, whatever that means, obviously that means that the quality of the school is going to decrease. What student is going to promote higher standards? To have higher hurdles to jump over? That's
Of course not.
Of course not. Who would do that? So the fact that, for example, in universities nowadays, it is a common practice to have students fill out surveys at the end of each semester, and those surveys are considered material evidence for the granting or not of tenure. In other words, professors are promoted to tenure if they're sufficiently popular, because that is the only way to have good surveys come out of a student. I mean, that goes without saying. The only way to go around that is having high standards, but also working a lot with the students in order to bring them up to those standards. That's not possible for everyone, especially if the classes are very large. So in very large universities, the most popular professors are the ones that are promoted to tenure. The other component of what the Frankfurt School had promoted, and that is coming again to full bloom now, is social justice, which again, as many other economic theories, appeals to our sensitivities. I mean, who wouldn't want to be just to the rest of society? Social justice, however, in the thinking of these particular philosophers and theorists, is associated with, again, the struggle between the classes. Now, the class could be a capitalist versus a bourgeoisie, but we could be also a struggle between races. Why not? It has to be a struggle. There has to be an oppressor in society. So if we see success, is because somebody has stolen from somebody else. If success is often seen in a particular race, well, then that race must be the oppressor of other races. And that's how we come to the current racial tensions in the country that are supported and encouraged, let completely loose under the premise that if somebody has a shop, it's because they stole from somebody else, and that somebody else is probably somebody of a racial minority. That is completely ingrained in progressivism. There has to be a struggle, and there has to be, therefore, social justice to fix the struggle.
And there has to be a scapegoat, an enemy.
There has to be. And then we see the ironic, tragic situations where white social justice warriors destroy the shop of an African-American shop owner.
Mm-hmm. And this happened multiple times, not just once.
Yes.
Yeah.
Completely forgetting that we were trying to protect the minority. Yes.
Yeah, they were a shop owner. So
they
were the oppressor.
They have to be the oppressor, even if they are a minority in terms of race.
Yes, and there have been some people involved in these riots that have said it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. If you have African-American biological heritage, but you're not on board with our agenda, you're not really black.
Making the definition of race, just as the definition of sex, completely arbitrary. It's what is convenient at a particular time.
Now, we talked a little bit about Herbert Marcuse as one of the Frankfurt School who came over to the United States and became incredibly influential. And he wrote a fascinating article back in 1965 titled Repressive Tolerance. His basic argument was that in any society that included structures and institutions, certain ideas that maintained those structures and institutions would be subconsciously ingrained into people's thinking, so that if you extended equal tolerance to factors that supported these structures and institutions and to those that challenged them, then those who supported the status quo would actually be advantaged unfairly. A truly equal playing field would require more latitude given to the challenges to the status quo and less to the supporters of the status quo. So he's basically making a rationale that says you must be tolerant, extend tolerance to the left because they are challenging the status quo, but you cannot afford to be tolerant to the right because they're supporting the status quo. And in this article, he makes several interesting assertions. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to summarize them, and I'd like to ask you to tell me, have you seen these principles in play in contemporary culture? Okay, so first of all, he says, true liberty cannot be, I'm paraphrasing. These are not quotes, I'm paraphrasing. True liberty cannot be attained so long as any societal structures or institutions stand because they all place limits on individual choice. The article rests on the Marxist assumption that progress is only made through a clash of conflicting ideas or other factors. Revolutionary violence, as opposed to reactionary violence, is justified because those who have been oppressed have been suffering under various forms of violence all along, and because progress can only occur through revolutionary action. A small number of elite intellectuals who have, and now I am quoting, reached the maturity of their faculties as human beings, end quote, and are therefore capable of rational judgment ought to decide which movements, ideas, etc. are worthy of tolerance and which must not be tolerated. Because he believed that revolution was necessary for progress, he taught that liberty required, quote, intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left, end quote. This active promotion of intolerance and suppression of the right includes the suppression of both printed and spoken words and the suppression of the right's freedom to assemble. Then finally, taking other works by Marcuse into consideration, a Father Joseph W. Koterski, in an article, observed that Marcuse championed, and here I'm quoting the article, openness to diverse sexual orientations and sexual experimentation, end quote, as additional paths to liberation from the oppressive status quo. So we've actually covered quite a bit of this. So you want to just summarize?
There is a point that is common to all of these statements. All of the statements, including the very idea of tolerance, and that's guilt. All of this needs guilt from the audience. Again, we were saying earlier about how a lot of socialism appeals to our desire to be good to others. If that desire to be good to others is somewhat marred by a sense of guilt, not having done enough, being excessively privileged based on whatever line of thinking, then we become easy prey for this kind of statement. On their face, all these statements are against the Constitution. I mean, our Constitution in the First Amendment mandates that everybody has freedom of speech, unless we put somebody else immediately in danger with that speech. But those cases are very, very narrowly defined. All other speech is allowed, and not just speech that we like, especially speech that we don't like. But as long as the audience is receptive with a sense of guilt, all of this can fly. None of this will make one's hair stand on end as it should and react with, no, this is against the Constitution. I'm an American. You're not going to take away my freedom of speech. As long as there's guilt or a sense of guilt, the audience will respond with, well, maybe it's right. Maybe I have too much.
Interesting.
Maybe I should share it with others. Maybe I should have shared it before. I have what it's coming to me. I deserve it. And yes, these people actually killed and maimed and destroyed, but we needed this cleansing because we deserve it. We stole from them first. That's not how justice works. The entire construct of guilt is not from God. And not that kind of guilt.
Well, yeah,
We
guilt
should
from
feel
sin is from God.
guilt, from sin, but
if we really have been greedy and we
Yes.
really have been selfish,
Right.
well, then go and rectify that.
Right.
But the mere fact of your success or your biological heritage as part of a particular race is no reason to feel guilty. Yeah.
This is a complete construct that is preying upon people who might have wanted to do good or might have had issues of their own. Whatever the case may be, there's the emergence of a sense of guilt that then internalizes these fundamentally autocratic statements
Yeah.
that are worthy totally of a dictatorship.
It is a misplaced guilt.
It's a very misplaced guilt.
Yeah.
But it's very effective, it's pervasive, and it's widely accepted these days.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to take another short break here. You are listening to The Dr. Maura Show with political scientist Dr. Simona Kragh on WCLP Lake Placid. We will be right back.
Did you know that married couples who practice natural family planning enjoy life more fully, live longer lives, and share their lives more intimately? Hello, this is Deacon John. Married couples really need to know the truth about contraception and the physical, spiritual, and emotional damage it inflicts upon their relationship and their families. Natural family planning is effective, all natural, has no health risks, does not cause cancer, and has no side effects that interfere with future reproduction. For more information, please contact Angelo or Suzanne at 518-483-0459. That's 518-483-0459. May God bless and keep you. This episode of the Dr. Maura Show is partially funded by a grant from the Respect Life Office of the Diocese of Ogdensburg. The Respect Life Office promotes and advocates for the culture of life from conception to natural death and is in charge of implementing the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' pastoral plan for pro-life activities, which include public information and education, pastoral care, public policy programs, and prayer and worship. We thank the Respect Life Office for all the good works that they do.
We are back, and you are listening to The Dr. Maura Show. I'm speaking with my guest, political scientist Dr. Simona Kragh, about cultural Marxism in the United States. Okay, so in an article that was titled The Quiet Revolution by Dr. Scott S. Powell, who is a political theorist and senior fellow for the Center on Wealth, Poverty, and Morality, Powell describes the quiet infiltration of Marxist ideology into mainstream America, which is what we've been talking about, cultural Marxism. And he talks about the three men that we've been discussing, which would have been Antonio Gramsci, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. But he adds the names of Saul Alinsky and Bill Ayers. Saul Alinsky is perhaps known to the listening audience because he was the subject of Hillary Clinton's senior thesis, and he remained her friend until the day he died. His work was also influential in Barack Obama's life when Barack Obama worked as a community organizer. Who was this Saul Alinsky person?
He was probably one of the more tame, as it were, as in terms of personality, proponents of progressivism. To the point where he was accused by others that were thinking along the same lines of being successful at most in promoting a local type of resistance against the establishment. So his ideas were along the same lines that we have described up to this point, more perhaps with a social interest rather than an economic interest. Not that they two were separate, but his emphasis was more social and more on the ability to connect with the public, to promote socialist ideas. And he didn't seem to be as espoused to the thought of a revolution that would completely tear apart the system.
He's most famous for his book, Rules for Radicals, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, which is a promise of complete revolution, because it seems to be the pathway to revolution. Yet he's somewhat stopped short of that. Not that he would promote peace among the classes, quite the contrary. But his emphasis was more on how do you show to the masses that the view of the capitalists is to be taken down.
Okay.
And so how to isolate the thought and of the opponent fundamentally and ridicule it to the point where it can be then tossed aside.
Yeah. Now, it's probably important to mention that he was never himself a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, but he did incorporate several Marxist techniques. And one of them that you just mentioned is ridicule. You ridicule your enemy into oblivion, right? Which is something that you see happening all the time right now.
Well, unfortunately, it's what the political discourse has become. By necessity in some cases and by choice in other cases. There is no more ability to simply have a political debate, to exchange ideas and even take the ideas apart without taking apart the other person. The ad hominem attack has become de rigueur, and that's what everybody does. And if there have to be lies tossed in there in order to take down the opponent, so be it. Nobody cares. When did it all begin? Did it begin with Alinsky? Probably not, but he certainly systematized it in a way that when the times were ripe, late 60s, early 70s, then it became a manual. For operation by Marxists.
Another of his rules for radicals was that you find a cause and you find a way to polarize people. You have an enemy and you polarize people. So it was sort of a divide that was absolutely necessary as opposed to uniting people on a particular front.
And that's exactly the connection with what we were discussing earlier, of appealing to people's guilt or people's desire to do good. If you want people to do what you want, accuse them of not caring if they don't obey. And all of a sudden you become the bad guy.
You're not with our group, you're with the other group, and that other group is bad. Okay, so who is Bill Ayers and what is the Weather Underground that is associated with his name? And at this point, I want to remind the audience that Patrisse Cullors, who is one of the founders of Black Lives Matter organization, was trained in Marxism, this is what she says about herself, and community organizing by Eric Mann, who is a member of the Weather Underground. So it's important to understand who these people are, to understand what the Black Lives Matter protests are.
Bill Ayers is the only one of the people we have talked about who is still alive. Let's begin with that. He is now in his 70s, and officially he is an elementary education theorist. He wrote several texts, several articles that are widely used in the education system. But he also is the promoter, one of the main leaders of Weather Underground. That became very famous in the 1970s for staging several bombings, several destructions of even government property. To the most accurate count, it should be around 2,000. The supposed intent was to fundamentally stop the Vietnam War. And in order to do this, since, according to Ayer himself, regular protest had not been sufficient, they started destroying property. In his mind, it was simply a much louder form of vandalism. In the end, there were casualties, some from the Weather Underground itself. And in an interview that he released much after the events of the Vietnam War, he stated, and I quote, "Kill all the rich people, break up their cars and apartments, bring the revolution home, kill your parents. That's where it's really at."
Wow.
This is a quote from an interview that was released to a Denisha Smith titled "No Regrets for a Love of Explosives" in a memoir of sorts, Protest Talks of Life with the Weatherman, published in the New York Times, ironically on 9/11, 2001.
Wow. Oh, my goodness.
Bill Ayers then went on after he left Weather Underground, which, by the way, ended up not being pinned for most of the bombings because of improper surveillance techniques used supposedly by the FBI. So they walked away scot-free, with the exception of Bill Ayers' wife, Bernadine Dorn, who turned herself in, I believe, in 1980 and was given I think a $1,500 fine and a 3-month probation. Bill Ayers went on to study education, achieved first in a master's in education, then a doctorate in education, and went on to train teachers for many years. He worked at the University of Illinois. He was, interestingly, denied emeritus status right after his retirement in 2010. Right after his speech that Robert Kennedy's son, one of Robert Kennedy's sons, gave, where he stated that he didn't consider it fitting for the university to give such an honor of the emeritus status to somebody who had complimented the killer of his father, because one of Ayers' works supposedly was dedicated to Sirhan, who had been convicted of Robert Kennedy's murder. So because of the association with that kind of unacceptable support, Ayers was denied emeritus status. He claimed that the whole thing was an invention by the extreme right, but he remains nonetheless, as far as I know, without emeritus status by the University of Illinois, that, however, employed him for years and gave him several honors, several positions of prestige. And in any case, his works have been and continue to be used by teachers. The titles that he included in his reading list in the training of teachers are quite telling, because they come from people, again, who espouse the most radical expressions of social justice and are fundamentally an instruction book on how to be a radical, on how to take down the system, on how to view anything in society as a struggle between classes or between races. And this is what has been taught to teachers now for generations, because it has been going on for quite some time. He was also the vice president of the Annenberg Challenge Grant, if I recall correctly, a grant of $160 million that was then going to be, and in fact was dispersed to several social justice initiatives, including schools that were organized by Acorn, according to some sources.
And can you tell the listening audience who Acorn is, or what Acorn is? Because that was a common phrase a while ago, but it's been a couple years.
Right. Acorn is an organization that promotes illegal immigration, social justice without any attention to already passed laws. It's a fundamentally almost a social movement that promotes views that are, according to some, contrary to our safety. As a last point, first president of the board of the Annenberg Challenge was Barack Obama. The connection between Ayers and Obama was a problem during the Obama race in 2008. It was exposed by several news outlets in the United States and in Great Britain. After what was then deemed a sufficiently long investigation, the accusation was dismissed based on the fact that Ayers and Obama might have known each other, but they were not very close. And later on, Ayers then condemned the Obama presidency, the decisions during the Obama presidency to heavily use drones in the fight against terrorism. But it was a tense moment for the Obama candidacy because, to go back to your original point, Ayers is fundamentally considered a terrorist. Mm-hmm. And he refuses that label because their target were never people. And actually, he condemned the 9/11 attacks because they were directed at people and not at property. Mm. So he draws that distinction. But many do not view Weather Underground.
Well, when you're setting off bombs,
Yes.
There could be collateral damage there.
And even the damage of property eventually has an effect on people.
Is there a connection between Bill Ayers and the organization now known as Antifa?
Apparently there is. According to an article published in American Greatness on August 4, 2020, there was a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing that took place July 28th of the same year, in which a counterterrorism expert, Mr. Kyle Scheidler, director and senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism for the Center for Security Policy, in which he said that fundamentally Antifa is an anarchic communistic movement that uses terrorism practices to keep Americans from expressing their views. And the direct quote from him is that while they do this under the cover of anti-fascism, the reality is that Antifa defines the entire American political system, regardless of party affiliation, as fascism. Scheidler explained during the hearing, therefore, that there is a connection between Weather Underground and Antifa in the methods. Other sources trace a specific connection in the sense that the views of Weather Underground were simply left dormant after the end of the Vietnam War, fundamentally, and after Ayers removed himself from the movement. He continued to maintain those views. He continued to write about those views. Ayers continued to infuse those views in the books that then were used to instruct teachers. And now those views are being picked up exactly as he wrote them by Antifa. And it's interesting to note that the cloak is that of anti-fascism. In the mind of most Americans, even those who, unfortunately, because of the failure of the educational system, have not studied World War II, fascism is a bad word. So being anti-fascist must be a good thing. So the cloak of anti-fascism is used by Antifa, hence the name, to justify its actions. But its actions are actually formed directly on the views of Weatherman, which is fundamentally a terrorist effort to undo society from within. And when cultural Marxism is not enough, then violence steps in and makes sure that people are not going to oppose any views that these groups, fundamentally Marxist groups, are promoting. It's all back to the same root.
And it's ironic, we have history repeating itself, because in the 1930s, during the Spanish Civil War, the Communist Party in the United States, and I'm referring now to Bella Dodd's autobiography again, the Communist Party in the United States gained favor because they were anti-fascist. Mm-hmm. which is interesting. Just interesting.
Again, it's the appeal to something good. And if people are not willing to go a little more in depth, they are going to swallow the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker.
Mm-hmm. So far, throughout this whole interview, we've been talking about false, misguided, even dangerous methods for addressing social problems. Now, the methods might be wrong, but the problems are certainly real, and the desire to solve them is commendable. It's, as Christians, we have a duty to figure out how to solve these problems. So let's just say a few words about the positive teaching of the church concerning social justice. Generally speaking, Catholic social teaching stresses the equal importance of two fundamental principles in economic and political and social organization. And those fundamental principles are solidarity and subsidiarity. Can you help us to understand what those two terms mean?
Solidarity goes back to the notion that we should be compassionate to our fellow human being. We should carry each other's burdens, as Scripture says. How do we carry each other's burdens? We pay attention to what our neighbor needs, because that's the person who is most immediately in our view. So if we ignore our neighbor, much less we can do good to anybody who is far away. Mm-hmm. Our first duty is to the people who are closest to us, and to gradually larger circles as we are capable.
Mm-hmm. And it's based on the acknowledgement that we are indeed all connected, because we're all children of the same God.
And we are
this
part
is
of the
John
body
Paul
of Christ.
II, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, and the part of the body of Christ. Yeah, for baptized people, but for everybody, we all still exist in God. So we are quite connected. So it's actually for our own good that we take care of our neighbor as well as the neighbor's good.
It's God's will, and it's good for us as well. It's good for our well-being as Christians.
Yeah. And John Paul II would say that, again, the needs of the community and the needs of the individual are reciprocal. So they're interdependent. They are not in competition with one another. Yeah.
In fact, the individuals should, in this view, appeal to the circle closest to him or her in seeking relief for any kind of difficulty. So the first step is being responsible for oneself. But when that is not possible and help is needed, then the people around the individual should be the ones to which the individual takes his or her trouble, just as much as the group around the individual should pay attention to the individual. So there's that mutual exchange that is fundamentally a loving exchange. Based on that, subsidiarity tells us that the larger groups, the state, for example, should never infringe upon the rights of the smaller group. So as the individual needs something, the individual goes to the family, to the parish, to the diocese, depending upon the type of need. And sometimes, yes, the state is necessary, but the state should not intervene where a smaller group can do the job just as well, if not even much better. And that's the principle that the church would like us to adhere to.
Yeah, the subsidiarity makes so much sense, because it is the people closest to the problem that have the best understanding of the problem. They should be given the authority to solve the problem. Yeah.
But they can also hold anybody who is asking for help accountable. Otherwise, the individual who might not be prone to take a lot of personal responsibility becomes just a number in a state that just hands out help. What is the incentive to do better? Close to nothing, because the individual is not held accountable. The group, being next to the individual, explicitly or sometimes just implicitly holds the individual accountable. It becomes a lot more difficult to waste other people's money if the people who have lent the money know them and have to live with them.
Right. So we have this balancing act. We want both solidarity and acknowledgement that we're all connected and our needs are interdependent and we need to care for our neighbor, and we want subsidiarity. We want the people who are closest to the level of the problem to be addressing the problem. We have these circles of influence, as you were talking about. What happens to a society that weighs too heavily on one side or the other?
Well, the refusal to go with any kind of subsidiarity means fundamentally that the individual will take no responsibility. And going excessively on the side of subsidiarity might mean that if larger gauge, as it were, where type of help is needed, it's not going to be given, and people are fundamentally going to be left out to dry, and that's
so we have
also
totalitarianism versus radical individualism. Neither one is good.
Neither one is good.
Yeah.
We have to remain consistent to the thinking that the individual has dignity, so he cannot be left alone to fend for himself or herself if greater help is needed.
Okay, so now we've been talking a lot about the moral imperative to take care of other people, and admittedly, capitalists have a rather spotty record when it comes to taking responsibility for the common good. Now, many, and I think this is often overlooked in today's culture, but many capitalists have been wonderful philanthropists who treat their employees well. They build libraries and they perform all sorts of community services, but many have not, and they have been very bad for society. So people move toward what they see as the only alternative, which is socialism. But these aren't our only two options, I don't think. For example, there is a system called distributism that many great Catholic thinkers, such as G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy Day, have favored. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea?
With distributism, we are looking again at means of production. So this is going to be now familiar because we have discussed Marxism, but instead the means of production being collectively owned, fundamentally owned by the state. They are going to be owned by the widest number of people possible. Ideally, in a distributed system, everybody has what they need in order to provide for their own needs. That takes away dependence on other people, and therefore the power struggle that could happen if one were to have more than another and lord it over the individual who is in greater need.
So we're talking a kind of a maximization of small family-run businesses, family-run farms.
Yes.
Yeah, homesteading.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, even Chesterton admitted that just like most of our lives, we can tend to it, but it's probably going to be very difficult to achieve it on this side of heaven.
Right. And of course, you're not going to seize property and break it up because, again, that would be theft. We can't do that. Right?
Exactly. So it's an ideal to tend to. But in part because of the difficulties and unrest of the more recent months, more people than in the past have been thinking along these lines, either to protect themselves from future shortages or simply because they are tired of the system as it is, the system being not necessarily the capitalistic system, but a system of control where either one is extremely successful or one is owned by the state and dependent upon the state. So the idea to get away from state dependency, the mentality of state dependency in anything, in food production, in education, in entertainment, is taking hold in more people than it used to be. Compared to the past, for example, people are warming up to the idea that is becoming more and more popular of establishing educational pods. Which are groups of people, groups of families that come together and put resources together, hire a teacher and have their children taught within a very small group. It doesn't mean it's for everybody. It doesn't mean I'm personally advocating for it, but it is an observation that people are trying to think outside the box. Things have been done in a certain way up to now, and they're broken. The flaws of the system as it is has been seen. Interestingly, though, contrary to the Marxist view, there doesn't seem to be an idea that the system is broken, therefore we expect a revolution and a violent one at that. It's more of taking responsibility and finding creative solutions.
Yeah, we can be creative. These are not our only options. There are other possibilities out there. But of course, the bottom line for Christians is, of course, there's no system is going to be successful without Christ. Because the flaws in our systems emanate from the flaws in the human heart, right? We can legislate moral behavior, but we certainly cannot legislate love and respect and the good heart required to follow good laws willingly and direct our behavior toward what is good in all the many, many areas that are not addressed by civil laws, where you could theoretically cheat if you did not have a good heart. So evangelization is essential to social justice. I want to thank you, Dr. Kragh, for this has been just a fascinating and an enlightening interview. Do you have any recommendations out there for listeners who would like to learn more about cultural Marxism?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. And being aware, first of all, that there is such a thing as cultural Marxism is the first step. Because I think many of us are simply immersed in it. And if you're immersed in something, you don't see that actually you are there. So the first thing is open your eyes. The second thing is to make use of technology if available to you, as it is for a lot of people now. Run quick searches. Sometimes reality is right in front of our eyes. Search the views of the people who propose to be the solution to a problem. What are they actually saying? And given what we discussed today, maybe can you recognize any of those elements in what they're saying? And armed with that initial knowledge, you might be able to see that the root of what some of these savior-type politicians are proposing goes actually into a tree that you probably do not want to climb. So be careful and be aware of what is out there. Be careful with the embellishments, and be aware of the fact that certain political ideologies are real. They have been real for decades, and they have not yielded good fruit.
Well, thank you so much once again, and God bless you.
Thank you.
The Dr. Maura Show is a local production of Light of Truth Incorporated for 98.3 FM WCLP Lake Placid. WCLP is entirely listener-supported. To donate, visit our website, www.lightoftruthministries.org. That's www.lightoftruthministries.org.